Hello, it's me, James, and I'm here with Spug. Hello, Spug.
Hello, James.
And we are eagerly awaiting the slightly re-delayed release of the Dark Phoenix Saga. And there are so many exciting cards in the set that we've decided to do some best of videos. Not one, but multiple. There's that many of them. And this
Yes.
one is going to be about control and removable and generally making a pain in the bum of yourself to your opponent. So, without further ado, Spug, let me change my scene and we'll get the first card up, which is
It is.
Mystique.
Yes.
Mystique Freedom Force is a 2-cost mask, and her primary ability, or her first ability, which is the one we're going to concentrate on, says, while Mystique is active, reduce damage from opposing characters' abilities by 1. A long-standing and very useful ability, which appeared, I think, first on Captain America, later on Iron Fist promo, and most recently on, I believe, Black Widow Agent. Spug,
Yes.
what do we reckon about this?
Yeah, this is a really interesting re-implementation of that Black Widow agent card because obviously she's one cheaper, which is really good. She is but she doesn't have the kind of protection that Black Widow offers herself in terms of not being able to be targeted by global ability. So you can't force attack her, or you can't wand her off, or that kind of stuff. So it is interesting you've got that balance. Obviously, Mystique's stats also are pretty horrendous. I mean, I'm eyeing that 2 fielding cost for sidekick stats, which is horrendous. But the fact that she's 2 means that she's really easy to get her out. You could even buy multiples if you wanted to early in the game. So I think this is going to be a really good and useful source of control because there are quite a few abilities where there are
Indeed.
sort of 1 damage.
There's one from this very set, which is Jubilee, which is the reprint of the Johnny Storm, which pings both the opponent and a character when you field something. So that's just 1 damage. That will be nerfed, and you wouldn't be able to use Jubilee's ability to remove Mystique, which is also pretty annoying.
Yes.
You'd have to find some other way of doing it. So Barrett also does 1 damage when you, I think, spend a mask for fielding or global abilities.
That's
also
right.
Horribly nerfed. However, there are some which deal 2 damage. Thor, when you feel the character deals 2 damage to the opponent or to a character die, so he would be able to get rid of her, and presumably would. Also, Iceman deals 2 damage, but not to a character, just to the opponent. So you can't get rid of her with Iceman. You would still do 1 damage, but you're going to have to find some other way of triggering Iceman apart from Turk, which is the de rigueur way of doing it. Perhaps using Wand. I think if you're going to play that kind of team, Wand might become pretty useful because, okay, you lose a life. Is it lose a life?
Yes, you do.
Take 1.
Yeah.
Lose a life, but that's well worth it if you can then do 2 to your opponent.
Totally.
And yes, you can, because Mystique's ability does not cover global abilities, it just covers character abilities. She is vulnerable to Wand in the way that Black Widow was not. So there you go. That's Mystique. Pretty good for a 2-cost, I reckon. Shall we move on?
Let's do it.
Next one is, let's get rid of that, and the next one is, okay, there are 2. There's Jean Grey, uncommon, who says, while Jean Grey and one of your sidekick dice are active, your opponents must pay 1 extra to use a global ability. And she's a 4-cost. And then there's Jean Grey Rare, who's a 5-cost, but dispenses with the necessity to have a sidekick in the field, and she also has the secondary ability while you have a different X-Man character die in your field. Zone Jean Grey is free to field, which is really handy because her fielding costs are 1, 2, 3, and not and you will roll it on the high side for sure.
Yes.
So she very much evokes Oracle from times gone by, and the modern version of that is Pip. Spug, what do we think of taxing globals? Pretty strong?
Yeah, no, she is strong and she is really irritating. I mean, I think we've probably christened these kind of cards as the anti-fun cards because globals can be great fun. And if you suddenly having to pay 2 energy to use a global, or potentially even more if it's a higher cost global, then that can make a lot of this stuff completely untenable. So for all the things like the Turk Barrett Iceman team, for example, or even just things like if you're wanting to use a prep global and that kind of thing, suddenly having to pay 2 for it makes it so much more difficult just to continually do it through the game. So they are a real pain in the bum. What we haven't seen, though, is much Pip the Troll use in the current sort of top tier modern meta. So
yeah, that's true.
That does raise the question of to what extent these two will be seen. I think if they were slightly cheaper cost, if it was a 3 cost, then that would definitely see a lot of use, I feel. But players might feel they're slightly too expensive and there are other better control options out there. But these are definitely interesting, and where there are so many globals, then
That
definitely
said,
some players will use them.
Lots of useful globals in the new set, some of which can be used to reduce the cost of stuff. Plus, you have Hope. There's always Hope, and there's also Kitty Pryde, who reduces the cost of X-Men dice, who probably will get quite some play. So you might not have to pay 4 or 5, and you could get around the fielding with Mutation, for example, the basic action. So I reckon we might see a resurgence of global control, but perhaps we should. Yeah, poor Turk. Turk just gets it every which way, doesn't it? Okay. Let's move on to the next one. From global control to... okay, so Lilandra, the uncommon, actually says, while Lilandra is active, your opponent must spend 1 to use each action die. So that's like the equivalent for action dice. But maybe slightly more interesting, or depressing, depending how you look at it, is the super rare, which says, while Lilandra is active, your opponent must pay 2 life to use an action die or global ability. So it covers both bases. Paying 2 life doesn't trigger when damaged effects. It's 2 life. And this is more or less a reprint of the horrible, depressing Jinzo. But she's even cheaper, although she has not quite such good stats. Spug, what do we think about it?
Well, in some ways, I would rather face a Lilandra than I would face a Jean Grey, making those globals more expensive, because I feel like paying life early in the game certainly is not doesn't feel that big of a deal. I mean, maybe later on you definitely comes back to bite you. And given the fact that you only have to do it 10 times to literally kill yourself, that's it is an expensive amount to pay. If you want to do 2 globals in 1 turn, then you're basically losing 1/5 of your life. So she is going to be difficult. Players are definitely going to use it, and the fact that she's 1 cheaper than the card that she's originally based on makes her much more easily purchasable, with things like the Dark Phoenix Global and even Kree Captain still in the game. So this is definitely going to see play. The people who enjoy messing with their opponents are going to want to get this card.
You might think 3/3/5 attack is not, well, it's obviously not as bad as Jinzo, so you might want to force attack it off the field, but then you're immediately paying 2 life for the force attack.
Yes, exactly.
So you took 5/5/7 is not insignificant, I think.
No.
Yes. I've committed suicide on Jinzo on several occasions. I don't really look forward to seeing Lilandra across the table.
No.
Okay, let's push on to the next one, which is Moira. Also connected to action dice, but a different kind of thing. She's a 2-cost shield, and while Moira is active, when an opponent fields a continuous action die, re-roll it. If it lands on an action phase, they may field it normally. Otherwise, send it to the used pile. Evokes a little bit Scarlet Witch from times gone by, from X-Men First Class, right? But Scarlet Witch is more expensive, but is has a sort of wider effect because she's not restricted to continuous dice. But Spug, what continuous dice might be a bit of an issue these days?
Let's have a think. Well, there's a certain Godcatcher, which is obviously one of the big 3 kind of win cons at the moment with Becky and Thor, and obviously this is a continuous action die that produces a 10/10 token when you use another or even another copy of this very action die. So that Moira is very much an anti-Godcatcher die. Interestingly, Lilandra obviously does have a bit of a kind of off-putting factor when it comes to this too, because you'd have to pay 2 life every time you want to use your Godcatcher dice. But there is a note of clarification that we need here, isn't there, James, with this?
Yes, we should be clear about what use means. Use for an action die, for a continuous action die, is fielding, is when you put it into the field and it stays there. And in this case, until it triggers. And Godcatcher's trigger is when you field or when you use another action die. But Moira says, while Moira is active, when an opponent fields a continuous action die. So you might think, okay, so when I've got one Godcatcher continuous die in the field and I field the next one, then I should be able to trigger the one that's already in the field, producing the token, right?
Yeah.
But there is a question about whether that actually happens or not, because later it says they may field it normally. So does that mean they didn't field it if it landed on an energy face, or they did? Or I would have preferred to have seen it written when your opponent would field. Maybe that would make it a bit clearer. But I think that needs a bit of a ruling as to whether the second Godcatcher can trigger the existing Godcatcher in the field before it gets.
Yes. The big question with this card really will be whether the threat of Moira will stop Godcatcher players from playing Godcatchers, or whether there'll be a situation further down the line where basically nobody actually plays Moira, so all the Godcatcher players start bringing Godcatchers back, and then everyone starts playing Moira again. She's a 2-cost, she's cheap, you can easily get her in the field, so that'll be an interesting kind of mind game, I think.
She could be Beckied out on turn 1, so it certainly is an interesting game. Okay, let's get rid of that and move on from Moira to Mr. Sinister, who has both a global ability and his own ability. We'll start with his ability, which is when fielded, ignore all text on opposing character cards, including global abilities, until end of turn, which is very much what Shriek, the more expensive Shriek Dark Empathy, used to do before she was rotated out. Spug, do we think that will see play?
Yes, I do, because it is, that Shriek was called sort of prismatic spray on legs, wasn't it? Because obviously there was the old prismatic spray die that would have the same effect. And this, obviously, there is something very useful about being able to blank everything on your opponent's side without targeting all the globals and everything, which is really good. Obviously, it doesn't affect basic action cards or action dice, presumably, because it specifies character cards. So things like Static Field, for example, which is a global on a basic action, wouldn't be affected by this. But we're also very interested in the global, aren't we, James?
Yes, perhaps more so the global, because the fielding costs are appalling, and he is a 5-cost where Shriek was a 4-cost. So don't know, but the global says it's also a bit expensive, but it says pay 3 generic. Ignore target attacking character die's text until end of turn. What attacking die's text might you want to ignore?
You're giving me all the hard questions today, James. Well, a certain Becky Lynch might be the one that people particularly want to avoid. Obviously, that Overcrush, or indeed anything with Overcrush. Obviously, that's not very sustainable to keep 3 energy back every turn, given that often you're only rolling 4 dice. So, this. You're only going to be able to do that for a certain period of time, but it might save your skin, and it might give you the ability to win with 1 extra turn. So again, Mr. Sinister's got 4 interesting cards that have 4 different and interesting globals.
Yeah,
but
that's also true.
So we'll see how much play that sees.
Indeed. Let's crack on to the next one, which is Vulcan. Okay. He's a 6-cost fist. While Vulcan is active, your opponent's non-fist characters get -2 defense. He also has a force attack global, a fist force attack, which is not limited to once a turn. And he has some nice fielding and stats, and he is extremely evocative of those who remember AVX, Venom, Angelo Fortunato. Doesn't have the full ability, but he's got the important bit, I think. This is another one like Jinzo, not something I enjoyed seeing across the table. Spug, what do you reckon?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Obviously, the first thing we should note is that anytime a character's D is reduced to 0 or below, they are immediately KO'd. So anything like a Moira or a Mystique or a Sidekick, as soon as it's fielded, it's going to be knocked out unless it's a fist character. So this is going to obviously offer a really interesting level of control, because a lot of those sort of weenie characters won't be able to stay in the field. But this obviously makes it very hard for players to to go wide, unless they have a fist character. Obviously,
Indeed. Although they'll still lose the sidekicks, but at least you can keep a bit of defense in your field by having, because we should remember that Vulcan his ability only works on non-fist characters, so might be well worth keeping a cheap fist character on your team, which has some other utility.
Exactly. It's worth noting that he has the ability to remove himself. So it gives your opponent the ability to remove him, if you like, with that global, because you could force attack him off.
Indeed.
But the other thing you have to be wary of with him is, of course, if your opponent has an ability that on a low D character that they want to continually reuse. So, for example, Pip the Troll, it will mean that as soon as Pip the Troll hits the field, he'll do his ability, spinning to opposing characters out, but then he will immediately be KO'd. So then it gives your opponent the opportunity to refield him every single turn. So that can actually be to your detriment.
Indeed. Let's move on, shall we, to the next one. Let's get rid of him. And the next one is Storm Queen, who has tiny text that I can't read. She's a 7-cost bolt and says, when fielded, re-roll target character die. Okay, good. When Storm attacks, re-roll up to 2 opposing character dice. Nice. And then the next sentence presumably applies to both of the previous two. Move each die that does not roll a character, and I'll correct it for you, to the opponent's use pile. There's a typo in there. Storm deals 2 damage to your opponent for each die moved. And then she has Energize, which says reroll a target opposing character die. But I guess that the moving to the use pile and the damage don't apply to that, presumably. So that they would go to the reserve pool, right?
Yes. I mean, this is a devastating card. And there's a good reason why it's a 7-cost, because it has such an incredible ability to remove stuff from your opponent's field. I mean, obviously, it enables you to potentially, you get 50-50 chance of removing key characters from your opponent's side, some of the control characters that we've already mentioned. But obviously, if you target a sidekick, you've got a 5 out of 6 chance of doing that 2 damage, which makes her and things like Danny Moonstar way more effective. Obviously, she's a 7-cost, though. How am I ever going to get a 7-cost? Well,
before we get to her 7-cost, there is a sort of cheaper version, which is also from the new set, which is Psylocke. She doesn't do it all, though. She just does... Well, she does the when fielded, but it's 2 dice. So whereas Storm does 1 when fielded and 2 when she attacks, Psylocke is only a 5-cost, but she rerolls 2 opposing character dice when she's fielded. So a bit like Becky, and in fact a reprint of the old Storm Windrider.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't want to pay 5 either. Can we get it cheaper than that?
I think we can. And there's a Hope Summers card that many players will be familiar with, who only costs 3, and she basically gives you the opportunity to copy another X-Men character's ability. So you can field a Hope Summers, choose Storm, and then if you attack with her, she will gain Storm's ability. The very first time you field Hope, obviously she won't be able to use the when fielded ability of Storm, because you use Hope Summers' his ability to choose Storm first. But then if she does then get KO'd and you refield her again later in the game, as long as you haven't chosen another character, she will get that when fielded ability because she'll remember that she was a Storm.
Yeah. Unlike many other similar cards, she retains the text when she's no longer active, because it actually says that on the card, which that's kind of useful. And either way, she will get to use the when attacks on Storm the first time she's fielded, because that's already there, right? So if you're going to copy one of Storm and Psylocke, I imagine you get much better value, I think, from Storm, and it costs you basically the same.
Yeah, definitely. But I suppose if you want to pair it with a card that you might actually then be able to field yourself, you're probably more likely to choose the Psylocke, because it's going to be easier to buy a 5 than a 7.
True enough. Okay, so pretty strong. I think have we got one more? I think we've got one more. Let's get rid of that and have a look at the final. Okay, the final character, but 2 cards. I put this one in because it's kind of interesting. This is Dave Ken, M-Cron Crystal. When Dave Ken attacks, prep a die from your used pile. While a Dave Ken die is in your used pile, you take no more than 7 damage during an opponent's turn. I just thought this was interesting. I don't know how much play it will see, but it's really quite interesting because you can't target stuff in your opponent's use pile. So the only thing that your opponent could do to prevent that, apart from just waiting a turn until he leaves your use pile, it would be the Mr. Sinister that we mentioned earlier, whose actual ability, not the global ability, but the ability blanks cards rather than text. But I don't think there's anything else in Modern that blanks cards entire text without targeting the die. So I thought that was quite interesting. But maybe more interesting is the super rare Dave Ken Shi'ar Civil War. While Dave Ken is active, opposing character dice with purchase cost of 3 or less lose their abilities and are free to field. This is very evocative of the zombie Magneto. It's from Age of Ultron, and it was an important card, and this ability is pretty devastating. It's a 6 cost. Spug, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really good. I mean, I mean, a lot of these control pieces that we've mentioned in this video do suffer from the fact that things like there are a lot of spin out and a lot of spin down abilities in this set that remove stuff. And obviously he is a 6 cost. But if you get him in the field, you keep him in your field, it can be absolutely devastating because there are so many things that he can cancel. I mean, we've obviously already mentioned Mystique. We've already mentioned Moira, I believe. And it obviously just totally blanks those abilities straight up. But there are so many other examples of 2 and 3 cost characters that have got great abilities. I mean, poor old Turk. He's just completely cancelled. What can this do?
Eddie and Istrid, which are often used to remove your opponent's ability to blink back your Becky, for example.
Yeah.
Also Drax, the pacifist, the rare, and other little stuff like Gazer. But probably most significant of all, we've mentioned it a few times already, is Hope Summers.
Yeah.
Deacon is a pretty strong counter. He's a 6 cost, but I'm pretty sure that he is going to see some play.
Definitely, yeah, and he is going to be high on the list of must-have cards for control players in this set.
Indeed. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Spug, for joining me. We hope that was useful for you. If you've got any suggestions for cards that we might have missed out, maybe we've missed something great, do let us know in the comments. And watch out for the other videos about attacking and globals and stuff like that. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks very much and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.